biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is our weekend edition, and just a little bit later, we're going to have Kelly Shackelford and Dr. Merrill Matthews joining us as well. Might just, as a program note, mention an hour from now, we'll also have Oliver North. We'll be talking about his new book, The Rifleman, and a variety of other topics with him. Think it should be probably a very good conversation indeed. And before my co-host join me today, I thought I might start off with something I ended the program with yesterday, but I recognize that because of the way this is, very few, if any of you, have a chance to hear the last hour of the program, certainly the last few minutes of the last hour of program. So it's worth repeating again, because it really sets the stage for some of the things we're going to talk about. And that is how the Democrat Party is very different than it was not so long ago. Now, this one goes back a little bit further, but it's by Terrence Jeffries, and it's the idea that originally for Democrats, liberty was rooted in religious principles. And so he tells a story about the fact that a local newspaper had been promoting the fact that one of the candidates seeking the Democratic nomination in one of these congressional districts was a woman. And back then, not as many women ran for Congress. Nevertheless, that particular individual, the woman, lost and was defeated by an individual that we'll identify at the end of this. And on the 4th of July, the man that actually defeated her was the principal speaker in the city's historic town hall. He was preceded by the mayor, and then he was introduced by his grandfather. And the point that Terrence Jeffries, who's been on the program with us before, is saying is it was not your typical Democrat message. For example, the speaker said, "Throughout the years down to the present, a devotion to fundamental religious principles has characterized American thought and action." And so he went on to tell the crowd that he believed in God-given rights and the autonomy of the individual, in contradistinction to and against this idea of collectivism and the dominance of the state. He went on to say our government was founded on the essential religious idea of integrity of the individual. It was the religious sense which inspired the authors of the Declaration of Independence. And then he talked about the fact that many of the leaders and founders of this country, the framers of our Constitution, those who were actually inspired to actually write the Declaration of Independence, in many cases held to those ideas. And then he said in our greatest leaders, he talked about this idea of historic moments. He said it was the essential religious idea. And so then he began to go through a list. Our legislation, and especially our earliest legislation, was inspired by this deep religious sense. Our first leader, George Washington, was inspired by this deep religious sense. Abraham Lincoln was inspired by this deep religious sense, he continued. And thus he said, we see a nation that has ever been inspired by these essential religious ideas. I think you get the idea. So then now the speech turned. And he argued that the very principles upon which our nation had been founded were being attacked not by foreign adversaries, but by forces within America. And he said, today, these basic religious ideas are challenged by atheism and materialism, at home in the cynical philosophy of many of our intellectuals, abroad in the doctrine of collectivism, which sets up the twin pillars of atheism and materialism as the official philosophical establishment of the state. And so this individual, which Terry Jeffries refers to as a northeastern urban Democrat, essentially, as he points out, believed that American idealism was rooted in our combined traditions of private property and property ownership and religious devotion, both of which could be traced back to the first colonists who settled on the continent. And he argued that these secular materialists seeking to control America's future denied the greatness of our past. And then he went on to say, in recent years, the existence of this element in the American character has been challenged by those who seek to give an economic interpretation to American history. They seek to destroy our faith, he said, and our past, so that they may guide our future. He said these cynics are wrong, for while there may be some truth to their interpretation, it does remain a fact, he says, that the most important one, that the motivating force of the American people has been their belief that they have always stood at the barricades by the side of God. The right of the individual against the state has ever been one of the most cherished political principles. The American Constitution, he said, was set down for all men to see these essential Christian and American principles that are certain rights are held by every man, which no government and no majority, however powerful, can deny. Of course, he was not certain which side would win. Would it be the secularist and the statist or the religious individuals? But he was certain the battle was coming. He went on to say that we cannot assume that the struggle is ended. It's never ending. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, he said. It was the price yesterday. It is the price today. It will ever be the price. The characteristics of the American people have ever been a deep sense of religion, a deep sense of idealism, a deep sense of patriotism, and a deep sense of individualism. And so he then concludes by saying, let us not blink at the fact that these days which lie ahead of us are bitter ones. May God grant that at some distant date, on this platform, the orator may be able to say that they are still the great qualities of the American character and that they have prevailed. Pretty good speech, wouldn't you say? I can think of many people that even sit around this table, and others that we've interviewed would have said that. But what about this, if you will, northeastern urban Democrat who believed in American idealism and believed in property ownership, believed in religious devotion and those kinds of things? What happened to him? And so Terry Jeffries says, but did this northeastern urban Democrat prevail? Did his party support him and his vision? Was he ever elected to anything? Well, he points out that 4 months later, in November 1946, he was elected to the United States Congress. 14 years after that, he was elected President of the United States. His name was John F. Kennedy. And so then he ends by saying, would Bernie Sanders or Pete Buttigieg stand by him today? And if you wanted a good illustration of the remarkable change in the Democrat Party, it's that many of the things said by John F. Kennedy as he was running for Congress, later when he was a senator, and then finally when he was president, would not be endorsed at all by people in the Democrat Party. When we come back, I'll give you another example of that, but here you have an individual that spoke on the basis of the importance of religious devotion, talked about the fact that these religious ideas were rooted in the Constitution, in the founding of this country, in the framing of these various documents, and that he was warning that there was already those on the horizon with their secular ideas that were going to contrast that and conflict with that and eventually try to tear down those ideas as well. And so, if nothing else, on the issue of religious liberty, I think you can see there has been a remarkable shift just in the last couple of decades. But when we come back, I'll give you another example of a shift that's taken place in less than 2 decades on just the issue of life in the Democrat Party. I think it just illustrates, again, some of the things we talk about so often. These shifts are taking place, and it's important to remember our history. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Jonah Goldberg reminded his readers of a famous essay by Thomas Wolfe entitled The Great Relearning. It was an essay about the Summer of Love in 1968 in San Francisco. It had great significance to me since I grew up in the San Francisco area during that time, but it also has significance to all of us concerning our culture. He said that the doctors at the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic were treating diseases no living doctor had ever encountered before, diseases that disappeared so long ago that they never even picked up Latin names. He concluded that this happened because the hippies, as they were known, sought nothing less than to sweep aside all codes and restraints of the past and start from zero. They rejected everything from modern society, including basic hygiene. They had lots of sex with each other and shared everything from bed sheets to toothbrushes to food utensils. They were the beneficiaries of centuries of scientific investigation and wise application of sound medical and scientific knowledge, but they decided to tear down some fences and paid a heavy price. Supposedly, G.K. Chesterton warned, "Don't ever take a fence down until you know the reason it was put up." Unfortunately, we had a counterculture in the 1960s that was willing to tear down fences of civilization without giving much thought to why those moral, medical, and sexual guidelines were created in the first place. Does that sound like our world today? Moral anarchy reigns. Our society mimics Judges 17:6, where everyone does what is right in his own eyes. Sexual morality is now based on doing what each person feels is right for them, and marriage has been redefined by divorce and same-sex marriage. All of this suggests that maybe it's time for another great relearning. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Thinking Man Films, Patterns of Evidence, The Red Sea Miracle. The Red Sea Miracle Part 1 in theaters February 18th only. Patternsofevidence.com/Red Sea.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you are listening to this program, one of the reasons I wanted to spend some time, first of all, talking about that issue of religious liberty, and later when we have Kelly Shackelford in here, I want to get some of his comments about that, is to show you, especially if you're young, the remarkable shift that has taken place on just one issue, the religious liberty issue, and the idea that this government was established on religious principles, because back in the 1940s, that was not that controversial. It began to be much more controversial by the 1960s and 70s, especially as those who rejected biblical ideas got into the universities as professors and as graduate students and began to, in a sense, redraw and reframe the whole idea of the founding of America. Some of that had happened even at the turn of the century, but nevertheless, that was one of those issues which over a longer period of time now today, if you were to appeal to religious values, that seems a little bit almost inappropriate. Pete Buttigieg is an individual that obviously is fairly liberal in his interpretation of the Bible, and he even makes some Democrats uncomfortable even when he does use any kind of religious appeal, but he certainly would probably disagree with most of the things I just quoted from John F. Kennedy, Democrat president, and actually an individual who was still saying some of those things in 1960 when he was running for the presidency. And because he was religious enough as a Catholic, had to even go and make a presentation before the Southern Baptist in Houston, which, by the way, just as a footnote, was the whole focus of the doctoral dissertation by Nick Pitts, who's been on the program here. So that's one example. I want to give another one. Then I also want to bring a third example in about how we used to work together across party lines, and that has not happened. And again, for those of you that are younger, and even if you're older, just to remind you of what it was like. But let me take one more issue real quickly, and that is when we talk about Mayor Pete, when we talk about Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, or some of the other candidates, they have actually not been very favorable towards any kind of pro-life idea. And you might remember that we recently talked about Kristen Day, executive director of the Democrats for Life, who was asking some questions about, is there any place for a pro-life Democrat in the Democrat Party? And you didn't really get very good answers from Pete Buttigieg as well as from Bernie Sanders and others. But back to the point I've made so many times, there is this myth going around, and I think I'm probably going to do a commentary on this as well, that says both parties have become more extreme. Even yesterday, I used the example, go back and look at the party platform, for example, on abortion in 2000 by the Republican Party, and you will notice that the one in 2016, 16 years later, and the one coming out this time, 20 years later, is pretty much the same, if not identical. And since Kelly Shackelford has been on the National Platform Committee, I'll even ask him if there were any changes there, and I'm sure he'll say that they were not. By contrast, there are some remarkable changes that have taken place in the Democratic Party platform. And just about an hour ago, I had a chance to read a very good piece that was put together by Alexandra DeSanctis, who actually documents that. So I'm just going to read her paragraph because she did a very good job of helping us understand how the Democrat Party on its platform has changed remarkably. Over the past several campaign seasons, she says, the Democrat Party has shifted its official platform to reflect a growing commitment to erasing any restrictions on access to abortion, of which there were very few. And she points out that as recently as 2012, that's when the party removed the word rare. If you've listened to this program any length of time, we've talked about how candidate Bill Clinton, then President Bill Clinton, talked about making abortion safe, legal, and rare. Well, they removed the word rare from the party platform back in 2012 and replaced it with a sentence saying it now favored safe and legal abortion regardless of the ability to pay. Then in the 2016 campaign, the party platform called for the repeal of the Hyde Amendment, which actually has been added to spending bills on a bipartisan basis since 1976 to prohibit federal funds from directly underwriting or reimbursing abortion procedures. And I will make a prediction that the party platform in 2020 will sound a lot like what you heard from the governor of Virginia. And so this, of course, is a question that I think some of the Democrats are going to have to ask themselves that they aren't asking right now, because Alexandra DeSanctis points out that if you just take the recent Gallup poll, where you ask people, are you pro-life, pro-choice, undecided, are you Republican, Democrat, Independent? Okay, so this is how people self-identify themselves. That's not perfectly accurate, but it gives you an indication of where they are. And the survey found that nearly one-third of all self-identified Democrats also describe themselves as pro-life. But she then goes on to say that even Democrats who don't describe themselves that way favor restricting abortion more than the party would actually prefer. You can look at another poll that was just done last month by the Knights of Columbus in January, found that 6 in 10 Democrats support limiting abortion to the first 3 months of pregnancy. So that is an overwhelming majority, 60% of people who are Democrats. They vote Democrat. They are registered Democrat, say that, and half support bills to ban abortion after 20 weeks gestation. So you can see that, again, back to the point I've made more than a few times, is that when you hear this phrase, well, both the parties have become more extreme. Nope. The party of life, the Republican Party, has pretty much had the same platform as it's always had, and the party of choice has been the party that has changed it dramatically just in the last 2 election cycles. And if you go all the way back, of course, to before 2012, even more so. Let's take another issue, and that's by Scott Moorfield, in which he points out that when we look ahead to this election, there are a lot of possibilities It's a possibility that Donald Trump will be elected or defeated. It's a possibility that Democrats will hold on to the House or Republicans will take control of the House. It's possible Republicans could lose control of the Senate or they could maintain that. And so he says that holding on to the executive branch and the Senate and the House by retaking it, he said, are doable, but it's also conceivable that Democrats could sweep everything because they have the numbers, and if their turnout exceeds the turnout in the right places, they would win, pure and simple. And so he points out that what you could have again is a division in which you have, let's say, Donald Trump is the president, and then you have a situation in which you might have a Republican Senate and a Democrat House, which is what you have right now, or it could flip, or you could have both a Democrat House and a Democrat Senate. But he reminds us of the fact that not so long ago, that was no difficulty at all, because after all, Richard Nixon was able to appoint 4, he says, arguably conservative Supreme Court justices, even when Richard Nixon, a Republican, did not have a Republican House or Senate. He points out that Ronald Reagan's signature Economic Recovery Act of 1981 passed overwhelmingly in the Senate, 89 to 11, and then made its way through a democratically controlled House, 238 to 195. Even Bill Clinton reformed the welfare system with Republican help from the Congress controlled by the Republicans. Barack Obama worked with Republicans to make George W. Bush tax cuts permanent. Both also appointed a total of 4 Supreme Court justices with bipartisan support and very little significant opposition or obstruction from Republicans. And at this point, you have to come back to the phrase he uses in the middle of his essay, "My, how things have changed." Because now you can honestly say it is hard to find, let's go to the Senate first, any, quote, moderate Democrats. That would be Arizona's Senator Sinema, or it could be West Virginia's Senator Manchin. It could be Montana's Senator Tester, or it could be, soon probably to leave, Senator Jones from Alabama. And when it came time on the vote on whether to remove the president for impeachment, they all voted with Democrats. And so you can begin to see that, as he says, the age of bipartisan Democrats is long gone. And the point he's making is that may have been something that worked in the past, but unless Republicans are able to get all 3 branches of the House, Senate, and the executive branch, they're not going to be able to achieve a great deal. And even if the Democrats fail to only maybe remove the president and win one of the houses, you might get a little more with the Republicans, but this whole idea of bipartisan support has simply gone out the window. And that's just one more thing to remind you about the remarkable changes that we find ourselves in right now here in the 21st century. Let's take a break. I have a lot more to cover, and I will do so right after this.
(2020). Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let me just mention in about a half an hour, we're going to have in studio a couple of individuals, Kelly Shackelford of First Liberty, Dr. Merrill Matthews of the Institute for Policy Innovation, and by phone, we'll be talking for about half an hour with Oliver North. Of course, our two guests in studio will be with us for the entire 2 hours as we're gathered together there as well. So you might want to be looking ahead to some of that. Just a minute, speaking of looking ahead, one of the articles I've posted here is The Democrats' February Blues by Victor Davis Hanson. It is further down on the list because we jump over a couple of things I'm going to talk about with Kelly on religious liberty, a few things I'm going to talk about with Merrill Matthews in terms of the Trump budget and maybe whether or not some of these people promoting the Green New Deal are a little bit hypocritical. But if you go a little bit further, you'll find that. And that's the next point to make, and it's an important one, and that is, at the moment, the Democrat Party has really had a really bad string of bad luck. Now, again, luck, let's recognize we believe in the sovereignty of God. But let me use luck with quotes on that, because as I pointed out the other day, and I thought I would do it again, when the presidential election cycle this time a year ago kind of unfolded, and there were people beginning to announce when they would actually run and what their platforms were. And remember, the first debate was in July, so this was really early. It looked really good for the Democrats. And a couple of examples are, first of all, the Democrat Party had just won a majority in the House of Representatives. I already alluded to that. They'd also won a number of governor's races in key states. Matter of fact, those states that needed to switch: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. A couple of other states, Nevada, New Mexico, Maine. These were important states. And so having a Democrat governor, when you before had so many Republican governors, tended to bode well, because it suggests that maybe the country really was turning blue. Also, as we have talked about before, in terms of redistricting, might have been significant. I recognize that about this time last year, we were still talking about the Mueller investigation. And the fact is the president's approval ratings were really down. So there was a lot of, if you will, wind in the sails of Democrats. And all they really have to do, even now, even with all the, and we're going to talk about this week of bad luck that they've had, maybe 2 weeks, as Mark Stein today said, a fortnight of bad luck, which, again, is a little bit more of an obscure phrase for some of you Americans, is nothing else, is the fact that if you could, as a Democratic presidential candidate, win 10,000 more votes in Michigan than Hillary Clinton did, 22,000 more votes in Wisconsin, and 46,000 more votes in Pennsylvania, you become the president. And so there was all this hope that Julian Castro might bring the African-American vote. Beto O'Rourke would turn Texas blue and some of the Midwest. Tim Ryan would help us reach out to the Midwest. If not, we'd have maybe a real reach out to the African-American community through Kamala Harris or Cory Booker. And, of course, none of that worked out. But you now have, as Victor Davis Hanson points out, the Democrat Party having 4 of the worst days in recent memory, all in 1 week in February. So let's count them real quickly. Day number 1 is February 3rd. That's the Iowa caucuses. Now, a caucus would have been probably really a good start for the Democrat Party, except for the fact that it imploded. And as he points out, the new app-driven counting melted down, discrediting the idea of a caucus in the first place. The winner, Pete Buttigieg, basically won over Bernie Sanders, but that was not known for days, and won over actually 2 more delegates. And as I've said before, the Iowa caucus is more symbol than substance, more style than actual delegate counts. But nevertheless, this did not look good, Victor Davis Hanson says, because Democrats are kind of the party of Silicon Valley. They pride themselves, he says, on being on the cutting edge of youthful computer culture, but the inability to count simple votes was not a good thing as well. And then he goes on to remind us of some other things, because you have the meltdown in 2013 of the Obamacare website, which was not helpful at all 3 years later when you have Hillary Clinton running on that. And then you have the problem of the Clinton campaign and their so-called campaign analytics, and then their tech-driven polling. And after a while, it was not looking good, even back in about 2013, 2016. And in some respects, the Iowa caucus really, in a sense, just reminded people of what happened there. And so there, of course, was one of the first issues that you could certainly talk about. And then he goes on to talk about a few other things that were happening on that first day of February 3rd. And I'll kind of skip over those in the interest of time, simply to get to day number 2, because this one goes on for paragraphs. But okay, day number 2 is February 4th. And this is another little bit of a train wreck in which President Donald Trump gives the State of the Union address. And he points out, that is, Victor Davis Hanson points out, that even many of the critics of the president maybe begrudgingly admit that it was one of the best speeches of Donald Trump's presidency. And it also, on the same day, had a Gallup poll coming out that showed that Donald Trump's approval rating was 49%, the highest of his presidency, higher than when he won the 2016 election. And Victor Davis Hanson doesn't say that, but I will. That almost always there's a bump that takes place after the State of the Union address. And if you're at 49%, you can kind of figure out where that goes if it bumps up another point or two. And if that's not bad enough, because the president did so well, the Democrats themselves oftentimes, didn't stand. Some of them didn't show up, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Others walked out, like Tim Ryan and others. Some of them booed a few times. And if that was not enough, of course, we all remember what the Speaker of the House did, and that is tore up the official copy of the presidential speech, which was, of course, ceremonially handed to the Speaker of the House. That's just the second day. Okay, a couple more real quickly. Then on the third day, you have February 5th, and that's when, of course, the Senate voted to acquit Donald Trump on 2 impeachment charges of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. And this, of course, all started with the whistleblower complaint. But if nothing else, that is a good illustration of how the impeachment may have helped him, because when the impeachment inquiry began, he was at like 41%. Then now he's at 49%. It didn't go down. It went up. And, of course, we can go through some more of that. In the interest of time, I won't do too much other than to point out that the Democrats did not offer a special counsel report or draw on any independent investigation, which was exactly what was done under Bill Clinton. Would they have been able to maybe pull other Republican votes along? Maybe. They got Mitt Romney, and that's about all they got. But not having that and having what looked for a lot of people like a really partisan spectacle where you couldn't get one Republican vote out of the House, that didn't help either. And so as a result, that didn't work so well. And Victor Davis Hanson doesn't point out this, but it's worth mentioning also that Nancy Pelosi sat on it 4 weeks. And that seemed inappropriate, almost against the principles of the Constitution, the rules of the House and the Senate. And finally, now that we're down to our fourth day, you have then the Democrat debate on February 7th, which then in some respects confirmed some of the concerns that the party might be heading off the cliff. And Victor Davis Hanson doesn't say that, but how about James Carville? He's an individual that has been a Democrat all his life. He has been the individual that was one of the brain trust of Bill Clinton. And when he's beginning to say that the Democrat Party has become a cult, those are not the kind of words you wanted to hear. And as also Victor Davis Hanson points out, all 7 of the candidates, 6 of them of white, I should say, pilloried the United States as an inherently racist society. Of course, then you also, of course, already have lost after then the New Hampshire primary, the one individual that could be considered to be a minority, and that is Mr. Yang, Andrew Yang. So, I mean, in some respects, that was the case. And so this piece by Victor Davis Hanson, and I have given you just kind of a thumbnail sketch of all of the material, points out that if you look at 4 days, the Democrat Party actually endured the first full week of February. It was not a good look. Now, will there be good days for the Democrats in the future? Yes. Will there be good days for Democrat candidates in the future? Yes. Will there be days in which Donald Trump will actually step in it? Well, actually, after the break, we're going to talk about how even his friends, even his cabinet is telling him to stop tweeting. So we'll get into that in just a minute. So there will be days when it will be bad news for the president and good news for the Democratic candidates. But at least in that first full week of February, had some of the bad days that I would think most of the people in leadership in the Democratic Party would hope never come to return to them once again. Okay, Wall Street Journal talks about Trump's worst enemy. Donald Trump is Trump's worst enemy. We'll talk about that right after this.
During the past decade or so, pro-life state legislators have been passing laws placing common sense, often very modest restrictions on abortion. It's sad to see a lot of this progress wiped out when a different party comes into power. This is happening right now in the state of Virginia. The new Democratic majority in Virginia's House and Senate is working to pass a package of bills that will reverse these protective laws. One bill removes Virginia's requirement that abortions be performed by doctors. Nurse practitioners, physician's assistants, and certified nurse midwives will soon be allowed to abort babies. There's also a bill repealing Virginia's informed consent requirement, under which abortion providers must provide each woman at least 24 hours notice of her right to withdraw consent for the procedure, to speak with the physician who is to perform the abortion, and to know the gestational age of her unborn child. Another bill takes abortion facilities out of the hospital category, thus weakening their safety regulations. The hard-won requirements that an ultrasound be performed on each woman seeking abortion, and that she be given the opportunity to see that sonogram, will be gone. Mandatory parental consent for minors seeking abortion will be abolished. Pro-abortion advocates told Associated Press they hope to make Virginia a safe haven for women in neighboring conservative states. Tarina Keene, executive director of NARAL Pro-Choice America, says, "These laws have been about shaming women, stigmatizing abortion, shutting off access, discouraging doctors from providing this care." Care? These protective laws were a way to enhance safety and provide protective care for women who chose abortion, which is not care. Every abortion kills an unborn baby and damages its mother. Pro-choice advocates in blue states see the Supreme Court chipping away at Roe v. Wade. They worry Roe will be reversed, so they are proactively repealing these abortion restrictions where they can and negating a decade of progress. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
There's a lot of principles you can say when you're digging a hole. Stop digging, if your friends are digging a hole, hand them a shovel, or if they're beating each other up, just stay out of it. There's another one, when the enemies are swinging a sword at you, don't hand them another sword. And, of course, that's exactly what the president has done. And we may get into this a little bit more later, but I think the editorial piece that came out in the Wall Street Journal talks about how after a victory, this president finds a way to bring about a potential defeat. Now, that's not unusual. We've talked on this program many times that how Republicans can snatch defeat out of victory. But this is getting a little bit wearisome, especially given the fact that there was a real desire, I know, on the part of the enemies and the opponents of the president to find something else. They had Russia, they had Ukraine, they were looking for something else, and that ended up being Roger Stone. And if he hadn't said anything, I think we would have still had a bit of a tempest in a teacup, but it wouldn't have been another argument being made by just really pretty extreme people that this might be the reason for impeachment now. And the point the editorial board makes is the president's relentless popping off this week about the sentencing of supporter Roger Stone has hurt himself, has hurt the Justice Department, and has hurt the proper understanding of executive power. That's a notable trifecta, they said, for a self-destructive behavior, even by his own standards. And that is, Mr. Trump handed another sword to his opponents when he fulminated on Twitter about the initial recommendation of a 7 to 9 year prison sentence for Roger Stone. Before I get back to this editorial, let me just remind you of something I talked about yesterday. Everybody that has at least a clear eye to this, and, of course, there are a lot of people that because Roger Stone is a friend of Donald Trump can't look clearly. But if you just look at it in terms of the basic facts, it makes no sense for an individual that certainly has been guilty of some kind of obstruction, maybe even witness tampering. But for a 67-year-old man to get a 9-year sentence almost suggests that he would die in prison. And as I shared just the other day, Tucker Carlson, when this first came out before this whole flap took place, you put this in perspective by reminding us that the average rapist in this country usually gets 4 years, which is still striking. I'm going to look this up. The average armed robber gets 3 years. The average person who is engaged in a violent assault, sometimes a year and a half. So let's recognize we're talking about a non-violent crime. And with that, of course, most people would agree that the sentence was excessive. But I think the wiser perspective would be to say, just wait until the Justice Department with the sentencing guidelines or the judge evaluates some of this. We now know that the jury foreman or forewoman actually has some questions and all the rest. But the point is that by hopping off, by tweeting, then I'll go back to the Wall Street Journal piece. The uproar is obscuring that Bill Barr has every reason and authority to reduce the sentencing recommendations. Up to 9 years, they say, is extreme, as even some career prosecutors believed. All prosecutors ultimately work for Mr. Barr, and he's accountable to the voters through the president. So if the decisions of line prosecutors can't be questioned by their political superiors, the chances increase of prosecutorial abuse. If career prosecutors are king, then why go through the trouble of nominating and confirming an attorney general and his deputies? So the point they're making is sometimes when there's miscarriage of justice, somebody has to step in, either an appeals court or in this case, the attorney general, and deal with that. But before Mr. Barr could explain any of this, according to the editors of the Wall Street Journal, Donald Trump compounded his political felony by praising the attorney general for rescinding the sentencing recommendation, and that gave more ammunition to the Democrats and undermined Mr. Barr. And so now you have people saying, well, maybe we should not only impeach the president, but we need to impeach the attorney general. Now, if you follow this, you have the Attorney General Bill Barr finally speaking out and saying, wait a minute, this president is making it difficult for me to do my job. There are some that say, well, that's pushback from the Attorney General. There are others who tend to believe in conspiracy that are simply saying, no, this was all staged to make it look like he was independent, but this is a whole game that is being put together by Trump and Barr. Which I, first of all, just say, I always have trouble with these conspiracy theories because, as I like to sometimes say, they just aren't that smart up there. You know, you keep thinking that they got some wild conspiracy like you would see in the movies. they're just not that smart. As a matter of fact, in just a few minutes, we'll get Oliver North. He says, the reason I don't believe most of these conspiracies, since I work with these people, they're not smart enough to come up with a conspiracy like that. But then, after really saying that this was a disaster, and after, of course, Bill Barr speaking up on ABC News and saying that these outbursts by Mr. Trump make it impossible for me to do my job, the editors at the Wall Street Journal also point out how this president, even when he gets a victory, just can't leave it alone. And I'm just going to use a couple of examples because in the interest of time, you could go on and on about sometimes when the president wins. Remember the old, are you getting tired of winning? Well, when he wins, he just can't leave it alone. He's got to go and jump into it. And here's a couple of paragraphs. When the president fired James Comey, he couldn't live with the Justice Department's cogent and correct explanation of the FBI director's many mistakes. So instead, he tweeted the claim that he had taped his private conversations with James Comey. And that, quite frankly, could be said as one of the reasons why Robert Mueller engaged in a 2-year, $40+ million investigation of him, all in some respects, not completely, but partially due to the idea that he taped those private conversations. Then when the Mueller probe finally ended, Donald Trump could have claimed vindication and moved on, but instead he unleashed Rudy Giuliani to play in the, as they say here, the mud bath of Ukrainian politics and attacked a U.S. ambassador. And he ignored warnings from his other advisors until it was too late, and then gave the Democrats an opening to impeach him. Now, that also gets back to something we've been talking about off camera here, and that is, didn't we hear the president say that he never dispatched Rudy Giuliani to Ukraine? And didn't he also yesterday acknowledge that he did? And so these kinds of back and forth are not helpful. And I will say that if there's anybody close to the president, they need to say, Mr. President, your pride, your desire to go back and to maybe vindicate yourself and sometimes even say some things that probably would be better to be said in private rather than on a Twitter account are going to bring your presidency down. But we'll see where that takes us, because after the break, we are going to have in studio, first of all, Kelly Shackelford and Dr. Merrill Matthews. Oliver North will be with us. We'll be talking a little bit about his book, The Rifleman, and get another perspective or two from him, not only on the presidential campaign, but as an individual that was for a while the head of the National Rifle Association, what was happening in Virginia and what happens to our Second Amendment rights in the future. So we've got a lot of things to cover. And so if you would like to join with the conversation, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. We have a commentary today by Penna Dexter on rescinding pro-life laws, and then one that I posted that is also out today on the great relearning. Another quote from Jonah Goldberg. I quoted from him yesterday and quoted again from him today, and just the idea that sometimes individuals think they are really smart, but sometimes they need to go back and learn some of the basic facts of life. And we take you back to 1968, the Summer of Love, and the great relearning that had to take place then. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is our weekend edition, and we have around the round table individuals that you've heard from so many times before. Kelly Shackelford, President and CEO of First Liberty Institute. Our first two articles relate to some of those issues of religious liberty. And Kelly, it is great to have you in studio, and it was great to have your daughter on the other day with her book, Beautiful Outliers. So that was just a great opportunity. This whole Shackelford family are really bright people, aren't they?
Yeah, she's got me beat. She's a much better writer than me, and I went to law school, so I had extra years.
That may explain it.
She, it was one of those things. I remember my daughter. I never knew people like this. I've heard since that there are a lot of people like this, but she would rush to get her homework done so she could read a book. Mm-hmm. And she probably read a book a week growing up. And people that read that much tend to end up being better writers, and she got good training. And so that was special of me. I had something going on while she was on Point of View, so I went back and watched it afterwards, just went on the website, and that was really special to see my daughter on talking about her book that she wrote. If people don't know what we're talking about, it's a book for a devotional for young mothers, and it's a great book, but it's also, I think, the perfect gift when you go to a baby shower. Yes. It's a great thing to give somebody to get them thinking right, and really the common things that young mothers struggle with and that they need to get with the Lord on. So that was special. I appreciated her being on, and it was a special time.
You can find the link to it at pointofview.net. And let me also mention that we have Dr. Merrill Matthews. We got two of your articles today from the Institute for Policy Innovation, and so we're going to get into that. But we also have a special opportunity because we were supposed to do an interview earlier this week with Oliver North. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North kind of lost his voice, so he's going to join us today as we talk about this wonderful book. I love history, The Rifleman. And again, if you're not familiar, of course, Colonel North, U.S. Marine, New York Times best-selling author, and also the host for 17 different years, host of War Stories, a graduate, of course, of the Naval Academy, a Marine, was on Ronald Reagan's NSC staff. And Oliver North, I was just thinking, Colonel North, we have, over the years with Marlon Maddox and Penna Dexter and myself and others, we just got a great history with Oliver North, don't we?
We do indeed, Kerby. Thank you very much. And my voice is mostly back, so you're the first interview that I've ever had to postpone, and you're the first person back on the new voice. Thank you.
Well, let's, if we can. I thought we'd get into this. This is some of the guys around the table hadn't read the book, but I had, and of course it takes us through 1775 and the riflemen and these individuals using long rifles and flintlocks. But I thought something that would relate very much to what we're going to talk about with Kelly Shackelford is one of the people that gets mentioned early on is Reverend John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg, who was an Orthodox Lutheran pastor up there in Woodstock, Virginia, but he was also on the Virginia House of Burgesses and eventually ended up being in the militia. And so here's a good example, I would think, Colonel North, of an answer to the question that Kelly gets all the time about, well, can pastors really get involved in politics? Here's a man that was a pastor. He was involved in government. He was involved in the military, fought with George Washington all the way to the end. And so in some respects, great illustration of that.
Absolutely correct. Interestingly enough, he also had to get certified as an Anglican because at the time, you remember one of the things Patrick Henry did as the first real elected governors was to urge the passage of the Virginia Rights Act. It said you didn't have to be an Anglican. You could be anything. As long as you were an ordained minister, you could have a church. And the astounding thing of it was there were a good number of those, like Muhlenberg, the Reverend Thruston out where we live in Virginia, which is now Clark County, but back then it was all Frederick County. And he was one of those who did the same thing, became a colonel in the Continental Army. One of the things that Muhlenberg actually got promoted to general, and led a very, very effectively as a combatant. So I don't know at this point whether there's more outside of Virginia that did that, because Virginia, you have to remember, in the Revolution, Virginia wasn't where it began. That was Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, the Bay Colony, as they called it. And so Virginia gets tagged as the very first two commissioned officers besides Washington. After Washington is Morgan and the other rifle company commander, Chapman. And Stevenson, they went all the way they walked all the way from Virginia, 580 miles is the actual course. I-95 was not there. And it's all because Washington wanted 100 Virginia rifles. And of course, that meant the guys to shoot them and go and march all the way up there. Shortly after they arrived, Morgan and his company get signed to start pushing the British lines back toward Boston. If you look at the map that's in the book, you can see pushes them back away from Roxbury and away from Cambridge because they start shooting the officers. And then he sends the riflemen under Morgan all the way north to Quebec to launch an offensive operation because Congress wanted an offensive operation. I mean, the parallels to current history about, there was already an intrigue about getting rid of the commander-in-chief, Washington. It was happening inside the Congress. There were spies. There were traitors. Obviously, Benedict Arnold is one of them.
Yeah,
there were terrorists and threatening the lives of everybody serving in our military. It's a remarkable time, and the parallels to what's happening in our country right now are just remarkable.
And most of us know 1776, but we don't know 1775. And this is, again, you're going to learn a little bit about Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold and Sam Adams, of course, George Washington and Nathan Green and Richard Henry Lee and on and on and on. But you wrote this.
You have read the book.
Yeah. Well, anyway, just before we take a break, talk about the scope of this, because it really takes us up to before some of the events that most of us learned in history, Concord and Lexington, Bunker Hill. A lot of this, what precedes that? Tell us a little bit more if you might.
Well, let's go back to Virginia. The Appalachians, one of the things that in the aftermath of the French and Indian War, which 7 Years' War is what they call it in Europe, French and Indian War is what they call it here, the French get defeated. And then to make peace with the Paris Accords of 1763, the king says there's a partition line that runs down the spine of the Appalachians. So if the water, and here's how they did it. Again, this is British map making back in the 1700s. If the water runs east into the Chesapeake Bay, it's okay to settle there. If the water runs west and it ends up in the Mississippi in the Gulf of Mexico, then you can't settle there. Well, there were already tens of thousands of people who had, and most of them were of British descent. The British, there were a lot of Germans, but it's mostly Irish and Scots who forced their way across the western part and were causing problems with the Indians. So the king arbitrarily decides the partition line is there. And of course, then you end up with how they're going to pay for all the stuff that they spent in the French and Indian War, and he starts imposing taxes on everything.
Yeah.
And, of course, that leads to the Boston Tea Party. It leads to the kinds of fracases that occur with the Boston Massacre. And British, the governors themselves become threatened.
There you go.
And of course, the Virginia governor is the precipitating agent for the Americans getting in the war against the British. I'm sorry, for Virginians getting in the war against the British.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we have, I'm sure, a few questions around the round table for Colonel Oliver North. And if you would like to know a little bit more, we have an information about the book. You'll probably find it in your local bookstore, but we also have information so you can get it in hardback and Kindle. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Jonah Goldberg reminded his readers of a famous essay by Thomas Wolfe entitled The Great Relearning. It was an essay about the Summer of Love in 1968 in San Francisco. It had great significance to me since I grew up in the San Francisco area during that time, but it also has significance to all of us concerning our culture. He said that the doctors at the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic were treating diseases no living doctor had ever encountered before, diseases that disappeared so long ago that they never even picked up Latin names. He concluded that this happened because the hippies, as they were known, sought nothing less than to sweep aside all codes and restraints of the past and start from zero. They rejected everything from modern society, including basic hygiene. They had lots of sex with each other and shared everything from bed sheets to toothbrushes to food utensils. They were the beneficiaries of centuries of scientific investigation and wise application of sound medical and scientific knowledge, but they decided to tear down some fences and paid a heavy price. Supposedly, G.K. Chesterton warned, "Don't ever take a fence down until you know the reason it was put up." Unfortunately, we had a counterculture in the 1960s that was willing to tear down fences of civilization without giving much thought to why those moral, medical, and sexual guidelines were created in the first place. Does that sound like our world today? Moral anarchy reigns. Our society mimics Judges 17:6, where everyone does what is right in his own eyes. Sexual morality is now based on doing what each person feels is right for them, and marriage has been redefined by divorce and same-sex marriage. All of this suggests that maybe it's time for another great relearning. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Thinking Man Films, Patterns of Evidence, The Red Sea Miracle. The Red Sea Miracle Part 1 in theaters February 18th only. Patternsofevidence.com/Red Sea.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, it is our weekend edition. Of course, we have around the round table Kelly Shackelford, Merrill Matthews, and with us for a few more minutes, Colonel Oliver North. Again, the book is entitled The Rifleman. I'm expecting a sequel because I know we're going to go past 1775. But if you would like to get a copy, about 260 pages, a really interesting read. And for those of us that have read books like 1776 and all sorts of history books, this kind of gives you the backstory that sometimes gets eliminated. And it's available both in hardback and in Kindle. We have a link, and of course you can find it in your local bookstore. But Kelly Shackelford, I know you have some questions for Oliver North.
First, I would point out, I'm looking at the book right now, that it's not as big as 1776, so you can read it in much more of a bite. It's a good length, and I think it looks like a lot of fun. It's got a great cover too.
It is.
One of the things, Colonel North, that I know our listeners will definitely want to know, in addition to the book, is you were a leader at the NRA for a number of years, and I know they're in the midst of massive lawsuits and controversy right now, and I know they would love to hear your thoughts on what's going on there and how things are going, and just how you see things at this point.
Well, unfortunately, the lawyer that they've hired to basically run the organization at this point is taking us down taking the whole organization down the wrong path, and sadly, you see the results of that in last November's elections here in Virginia. I mean, they fired Chris Cox, who was probably the finest lobbyist that we've ever had in the organization. And regrettably, the end result was we now have, I'll put it very baldly, our governor and the state legislature, the oldest legislative assembly in the Western Hemisphere, is led by a governor who is a baby killer, a gun grabber, a race baiter, And that's a sad fact about what's happening in the Commonwealth of Virginia today. And in large part, that's because the NRA did not do what it was supposed to do in all kinds of elections. I mean, look at Bloomberg is now running ads in Virginia, for crying out loud. And he intends to become president. I don't want Virginia to turn into Massachusetts of the 21st century or California. And that's pretty much where we're headed. The gun laws that we're about to have enacted in Virginia are draconian, and it shouldn't be that way.
Well, Colonel, this is Merrill Matthews. Let me take you in a different direction. You call your book The Rifleman, isn't it? All right, so I've been reading through Bill O'Reilly's book on the Patriots of the American Revolution, where he talks about, I think, in Lexington Concord and Bunker Hill, some of the Americans who had their rifles, and they were expert sharpshooters, and they were very, very good at that. And then I've read in the Texas Revolution, when Ben Milam was taking the Texas Patriots in to capture San Antonio and the Alamo a couple of months before Santa Anna gets there, it mentions that the Texas Patriots with their guns were so accurate that when a Mexican would raise his head, they were able to get him. I don't think of those guns as terribly accurate. Can you provide some insight on that?
Yeah, exactly, Merle. The thing that made the riflemen from Virginia and Pennsylvania, who went all the way up to Massachusetts, different, was the rifling in the barrel. Everybody else was carrying muskets. In fact, very few of the New Englanders had rifles. They might have had them early on, but they certainly didn't have them during the Revolution. And so that's why Washington wanted the accuracy of a rifle. A musket is accurate out to about 65 yards. That's it. I mean, even though it's a great big size piece of lead that's coming out of it, it's not very accurate at all. These rifles could kill a British officer at 300 yards. Mm-hmm. And that's a long distance. And that kind of thing is carefully documented in this book.
It's fascinating because you talk about what it takes to actually do that, because you have to use the ramrod, you have patches, you have, of course, the powder horn. Take us through that for just a minute, because I think most of our younger audience never even understands what it took to finally load one of these, to tamp it down, then to have that flash, and then send that bullet on its way. What does that entail?
If you look at the end sheets, as we call them in books, most of them are blank nowadays. But mm-hmm. I like to put in all of my novels, I like to put end sheets on that actually relate to what's in it. So the front end sheets show the east coast of America and the 13 colonies, mm-hmm. and the route that Morgan takes. In the back end sheets are the tools of the rifleman's trade, and it shows a real long rifle. It shows the tools that they carried, a long scalping knife, as it was called, a hatchet, a shot pouch, and a powder horn. And it shows the mechanism of the flintlock. And in the book, as you know, because you've read it, it describes some incidents where it takes a lot longer to load a rifled barrel. It's longer and tighter.
Oh, yes.
Than it does a musket. And so one of the great things that Daniel Morgan does is Daniel Morgan figures out how to employ them in such a way that the riflemen are protected. And as you've already astutely gathered, there's going to have to be a little bit more about Daniel Morgan coming out probably next year.
Well, so we're looking forward to the next one. Just before I let you go, I figure that not only would you have some comments about the Second Amendment issues, but we have a presidential campaign. Have you ever seen anything like this before? If I had asked you maybe 20 years ago when you first were on Point of View that we would have a socialist running, would you have even believed that?
No. And part of that, Kerby, is the consequence of our educational system has failed these young people. I mean, when you and I were first talking years ago, the idea that you'd have a person running for president of the United States as a socialist. I mean, Bernie Sanders' campaign is right out of Karl Marx. I mean, it's all kinds of promises. It's the destruction of the free enterprise system, and it's socialism. And that's Karl Marx. I mean, Marx and Lenin essentially started what became the Soviet Union. Bernie Sanders took his honeymoon in the Soviet Union. By the way, just one more point I'll come back to the book for just 1 second. Inside the book, if you go to page 14 of what you got there in front of you,
got it.
There, the hymns that are being sung in the churches of America
mm-hmm.
at the time were not this deist, agnostic, not truly. These
Charles
these
Wesley.
were the actual,
yeah.
yes, These were the actual hymns being sung, and the practitioners of Christianity were those who formed this country. Now, it was their deeds, not just their words, that made a difference. But what I learned in doing all the research for this thing was the kind of thing that my mom and dad taught when they dragged my brothers and me to all those battlefields all over the country as we were getting transferred from one place to the other in the United States Army. And I look at this book as a wonderful opportunity for young people to see the kind of people who really formed this country, the kind of people who put their lives on the line. They went into harm's way. They were all volunteers. Nobody was drafted. And you think about the privation that they suffered. There were more people dying of smallpox in the American Revolution than died with British balls and musket balls or artillery pieces being fired at them. And they still came back and fought under the leadership of George Washington, who was not a deist. He believed in Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior, as you and I do.
Well, and again, Kelly, in just a few minutes, we're going to talk about religious liberty, but this Reverend Thurston shows up all the way through this book.
Oh, yeah.
And you have these pastors who are recruiting individuals. Of course, I mentioned John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg. He goes to the back of the church, and 300 of the men come and join him, and they fight these battles with George Washington all the way to the end. And so this idea that you can't be religious and be involved in politics, Kelly, that doesn't work very well, does it?
No, that doesn't. That's not the law, and that's not our history. And we'll talk about later. I just testified yesterday in the Iowa Senate over a religious freedom bill where businesses were testifying that it would be bad for business to have religious freedom. So it's crazy. They don't remember our history, and so I really appreciate, Colonel North, you doing this. The other thing I love is the title, which it immediately remands me of Lucas McCain.
Yes, indeed.
And what I watched. I loved that show growing up. So what a great title.
Johnny, who's the young boy? Johnny, I can't remember the name.
Very good. Well, Colonel North, always been great to have you on Point of View, and look forward to the next opportunity. But as you can tell, I've enjoyed the book. I think some of the people around the table are going to get a copy as well, and I hope some of our listeners do as well.
Thanks, Kirby. Appreciate you very much. It's great to be on with you again.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, a couple of things we'll talk about. First of all, I found this very good article about Kelly Shackelford up there in Iowa, and that was a Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And if you want to, as we've been talking about over the last couple of days, seen a remarkable change, even yesterday, using the quotes from an individual who was running at that time for Congress, talking about how religion was so important. That was John F. Kennedy, and how today people say, no, religion shouldn't be appropriate. Or, as I shared even last hour, how the various platforms on life have changed dramatically for the Democrats, been the same for the Republicans. One other good illustration is it used to be the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was not even controversial. No. Kelly goes up to Iowa, and I'm sure he's going to tell us a story about that right after this. And, of course, we've got a couple of very good articles by Dr. Merrill Matthews. So there are a number of things that you can read, including information about Oliver North's book. And so I would encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net, to find that. And we'll come back and first talk about religious liberty, talk about Trump's budget, and we'll talk about how it's been really kind of a bad couple of weeks for the Democrats. All that coming up right after this.
From Thinking Man Films comes Patterns of Evidence, the Red Sea Miracle. For nearly 2 decades, investigative filmmaker Timothy Mahoney has been searching for evidence of one of the Bible's most epic miracles, the parting of the Red Sea.
We're talking about a miraculous event of unprecedented proportion, of God's saving power.
The Red Sea Miracle, Part 1, in theaters for one day only on February 18th. More information is available at patternsofevidence.com/Red Sea.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Question. Where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer. Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and showing your support. It's easy, but you have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net, click the blue button near the top right that says Donate, or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Weekend edition, and certainly we have a lot to cover. And of course, we have in studio with us today Kelly Shackelford, Merrill Matthews. Let me just mention our action item for you today is significant, and it won't take you much time at all, but that is that President Trump has signed an executive order combating human trafficking and the online child exploitation in the United States. That is, I think, a very significant action. And so we wanted, so oftentimes we encourage you to write because you are protesting something. I would imagine everybody listening to this would agree with this. So there's a place where you can actually go to our website right now, pointofview.net, and thank President Trump for the human trafficking executive order. If you've done this in the past, you already have your information. If this is the first time, you can put in your email and your information, and then you can send a thank you to him. And if you would like to find that, it's very easy. It's our website, pointofview.net. The middle section there, take action on this issue of human trafficking. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. But I wanted to get to some issues of religious liberty. And Kelly, the other day you told me you'd been to Iowa. I went and found a very good article where they quoted you, hopefully accurately, about this. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Give us some history, because if I remember right, weren't Democrats even supporting this not so long ago?
Yeah, the basic summary I can give people is, for 200 years, we've treated the free exercise of religion as one of our most fundamental rights, and like free speech. And for those level of fundamental rights, what we do is we give a protection in the law that is the greatest protection we give any of our rights, and that is if the government infringes upon that right, free exercise of religion, free speech, there is a burden that's on the government to justify itself by showing that it has a compelling governmental interest that's requiring it to interfere with your constitutional right, and then it's doing it in the least restrictive way. It doesn't guarantee any result in any case. It just sets out the framework and how you do it. And it's one that respects those freedoms. Well, 30 years ago, there was a really bad Supreme Court case, the Smith decision, that said, no longer do you get that protection for the free exercise of religion. Well, everybody was like, that's crazy. And so, this was when Bill Clinton was president, right? They passed. They said, we're going to reinstitute those full protections in federal law, and they passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It passed almost unanimously, the House and the Senate. Chuck Schumer was the sponsor, along with Ted Kennedy, in the Senate, signed by Bill Clinton. Conservatives and liberals all agreed, and it was almost unanimous. Well, now all of us. Oh, by the way, that was only for federal. So the states then had to reinstitute it for themselves, and so about half of our states now have these Religious Freedoms Restoration Acts. All of a sudden these days, religious freedom is controversial, which is just crazy to me, but it is. And so now there are about half the states that don't have this protection, and Iowa was one of those. And I testified yesterday in Iowa, in the Iowa Senate. Senator Guth was the main sponsor, and it was his subcommittee. And it's just amazing to listen to these arguments. I was kind of the expert they brought in to kind of talk about this, because I've been doing this for over 30 years. And I pointed out how it's all face. One of our recent cases we won was a Jewish synagogue case where they literally put a swastika on the rabbi's car. It was brutal stuff, and they could not have won without a RFRA. So it was very important to have that Religious Freedoms Restoration Act. And the main argument being used in Iowa were some major companies had diversity councils, which LGBT members kind of take over, and then they bring these big companies in to say, nobody will come do business in Iowa if we have this religious freedom, and that's what they did in Indiana, if you'll remember, a few years ago. And so that was the main argument. And so really my main points were twofold. Number one was, I said, really, when you look at what's going on and how half the states have restored this full protection, the question is, why would Iowans want to have the least religious freedom, or at least be tied for the least religious freedom of any state in the nation? And my answer is, I don't think they want that. They want full protection. And so what is this argument? The argument is that it hurts businesses. And I said, number one, it doesn't, and I've got data to show that. I think it's obvious. I mean, more freedom begets prosperity. We all know that. But I said, let's pretend for a second that it really does hurt business. Since when are the freedoms of the people of Iowa for sale? I mean, to the business, I didn't know we moved to Potterville, and Mr. Potter is now controlling everybody's freedoms. I mean, I think that's an outrageous argument. I don't think it's going to win the day. The senators voted out a subcommittee after this, but I think it's a great example, and the article is, of the kind of battle for something that I think 90% of Americans would agree upon, which is, yes, the burden should be on the government to justify itself when it burdens somebody's religious. If it has a compelling interest in justification, okay, but the idea that we're not going to get protection for religious freedom is really bizarre, but it's showing that we have to fight for these things. And I'll give the senator credit. This is the third session he's offered this bill. Each session he's got it a little further, but he hasn't gotten it through yet in Iowa, which there's a lot of great churches and religious communities in Iowa, and they're still having to fight their way through this to make sure that their people have protection of the law.
Dr. Merrill Matthews, I was just thinking, if you go back to Indiana, at that time you had the governor, Mike Pence, I've heard of him, vice president, and you had a mayor, Pete Buttigieg, who actually were on opposite sides. Yes. So even now at the national level, you see some of the battle that took place in Indiana.
And they were able to put so much pressure on, at that time, Governor Pence, that he had to back off a little bit from what he was doing. But let me ask Kelly a question. We're hearing lately Michael Bloomberg going around and apologizing for all the things he was strongly supported 10 or 15 years ago.
Stop and frisk and others. Yes.
Other things. Are any of the Democrats who supported the legislation now coming up and saying, "Well, I've grown, or I've learned something, or they got me at a bad time," or anything?
Yes. I mean, for instance, the ACLU was behind this when it originally passed. Congress, the Religious Freedoms Restoration Act. They, of course, were for religious freedom protection. What's happened now is constituents within the ACLU, like their gay and lesbian group and et cetera, they don't like that people can actually follow their conscience against a gay rights issue. And so they have now gotten the ACLU to turn. They're actually wanting to pass a new federal law that would specifically go into the Religious Freedoms Restoration Act and remove protection. Anytime any of these issues come up, your religious freedom protection would be removed. So they have definitely, evolved in their understanding of religious freedom.
Yeah, and that shows up when you hear things like the Equality Act. That sounds like something, but that's the attempt to try to do some of this. So this issue that was not controversial in the 1990s is now kind of a firestorm in a place like Iowa, and was a firestorm there in Indiana. So,
I'm thinking there's listeners listening to us from pretty much every state in the United States, and probably a question you might be having is, do we have full protection here?
Probably not.
The 50-50 chance you don't.
Yeah.
And if not, it's something that somebody in your state, a senator or House member, it's a great opportunity, because it really is, if you're rational, it's a no-brainer. The idea that the people of any state want to have less protection for their most fundamental rights than any other state is, I don't think most people want that. I mean, it's only protection against the government. We're not even talking about against other people. This is protection against the government, that if the government comes in and tries to violate your religious freedom, they at least have the burden of proof to bring forward, a compelling interest and to show. I mean, who's against that? I mean, it really does take some people that are on really extreme edges to be against that, but they are. And so you have to fight for these things right now.
Yeah. Well, when we come back from the break, let's talk about those extreme edges, because as one individual pointed out, when the presidential election cycle dawned, the outlook was really bright for the Democrats. The party had won a majority in the House of Representatives. They'd won governor's races in some of those key states: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Nevada, New Mexico, Maine. Robert Mueller's investigation was in high gear. And then even after that, you had Ukraine, you had the impeachment inquiry and all the rest. And really all a Democrat would have to do is win maybe 10,000 more votes than Hillary did in Michigan, 22,000 more votes in Wisconsin, 46,000 votes in Pennsylvania. But as one of our articles we posted by Victor Davis Hanson points out, That was a bad week last week. February 3rd was the Iowa caucuses that kind of imploded, and then reminding people of the meltdown of the Obamacare website. I want to hear Dr. Merrill Matthews talk about that in just a minute. Then the second day of the train wreck was the State of the Union address by the president, and many people think it may be the best, and also Gallup poll saying he came up with an approval rating of 49%. And we might mention Nancy Pelosi kind of as a capstone. Next day, the acquittal of Donald Trump, and then the day after that, you had the Democrat debate. Whoever thought of doing a Democrat debate on a Friday night? I'll never know. And so it hasn't looked so good. So I want to come back and get some comments from people around the table here, our co-hosts. And most importantly, I want to hear from you as well. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
During the past decade or so, pro-life state legislators have been passing laws placing common sense, often very modest restrictions on abortion. It's sad to see a lot of this progress wiped out when a different party comes into power. This is happening right now in the state of Virginia. The new Democratic majority in Virginia's House and Senate is working to pass a package of bills that will reverse these protective laws. One bill removes Virginia's requirement that abortions be performed by doctors. Nurse practitioners, physician's assistants, and certified nurse midwives will soon be allowed to abort babies. There's also a bill repealing Virginia's informed consent requirement, under which abortion providers must provide each woman at least 24 hours notice of her right to withdraw consent for the procedure, to speak with the physician who is to perform the abortion, and to know the gestational age of her unborn child. Another bill takes abortion facilities out of the hospital category, thus weakening their safety regulations. The hard-won requirements that an ultrasound be performed on each woman seeking abortion, and that she be given the opportunity to see that sonogram, will be gone. Mandatory parental consent for minors seeking abortion will be abolished. Pro-abortion advocates told Associated Press they hope to make Virginia a safe haven for women in neighboring conservative states. Tarina Keene, executive director of NARAL Pro-Choice America, says, "These laws have been about shaming women, stigmatizing abortion, shutting off access, discouraging doctors from providing this care." Care? These protective laws were a way to enhance safety and provide protective care for women who chose abortion, which is not care. Every abortion kills an unborn baby and damages its mother. Pro-choice advocates in blue states see the Supreme Court chipping away at Roe v. Wade. They worry Roe will be reversed, so they are proactively repealing these abortion restrictions where they can and negating a decade of progress. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Weekend edition, we have, of course, Kelly Shackelford, Merrill Matthews, and I point you to a very good piece by Victor Davis Hanson, the Democrats' February Blues, in which he talks about in that first full week of February. Didn't turn out so well for the Democrats. They'll probably have some good days in the future, but it wasn't a real good day for them, or even a good week for them last week. Not a real good day right now for the president with all his tweets and everything, but what about this? The idea is that this, starting this time last year, Merrill Matthews, this was going to be something easy, and Julian Castro, he'd be the Latino Obama. Yes. Beto O'Rourke would put Texas and the South in play. Maybe we'd have an African-American running again like Kamala Harris, Cory Booker. Didn't quite turn out that way.
For the past 3 years, the media have been gloating that the Republicans are in complete disarray, and now they're lamenting that it's the Democrats who are in complete disarray. It is amazing, and it's all self-inflicted. And it's not that the Republicans are doing anything to create the problems. The Democrats are creating their own problems, and they have this problem of if you want to say, I don't believe Pete Buttigieg is a moderate, but if you want to say he's sort of moderate left, he's sort of claiming that title as Barack Obama did in 2008, tried to. Amy Klobuchar, if you take them and say, well, they're sort of the moderates, they're splitting some of the vote. But, you get this Sanders getting on a roll. And the latest, the poll that came out from Morning Consult, this was the first post-New Hampshire primary poll, has Bernie at 29%. That's up 4%. Biden drops 3% to 19%, and Bloomberg is at 18%.
Wow. And
Rasmussen is reporting today that Bloomberg actually in their poll is leading Biden by 2 or 3 points. So you've got it's amazing stuff that you couldn't predict.
It is. It's crazy. I'm a little concerned about a lot of the stuff I'm seeing. I don't like the idea of a billionaire being able to sort of buy his way around the primaries. I think this is a bad. I don't want that happening in either party. I do think that the key with the Democrat is really getting down to 2 candidates. I mean, I think the problem is you got constituencies being split up, so it's hard to tell. And I think then you throw in the Bloomberg thing, and it just creates total chaos, because here's a guy that nobody really knows in a campaign way. I mean, the stuff that's leaking out over the past week on Bloomberg is really bad stuff. I know he's apologizing for everything, but politicians who apologize as soon as they run, people take that a little bit with a grain of salt, although we're very forgiving in this country. But I think that's the reason why you should go through the process.
Right.
And so I think for him to jump in because he's spending hundreds of millions of his dollars skipping the process, it might turn out to be a very bad thing for the Democrats. But I don't like it to happen anywhere, because I do think our system is better when there's more vetting and there's more where you have to prove yourself, and you shouldn't sort of get a leg up on everybody else and not have to participate in things because you have more money. The other thing I would say is the Pete Buttigieg. I think that one's really interesting too, because here's a guy who's the son of a Marxist. I'm not laying terms. I mean, this is his father was very known.
Joseph, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so I think, and a lot of his statements are so pre-programmed. Everybody talks about this. It's like, I don't think anybody knows who the real Pete Buttigieg is. And so I think it's good that he's now getting some attention, and maybe we'll have to answer some questions. But I think it's such a confusing mess right now that you don't even know who the choices are. You're not sure if they're going to get down to the 2 choices. Is this going to go to a brokered convention? It's really been a bad couple of weeks for the Democrats, but I think it's maybe bad for the country to have all these things happen where you can't even figure out where people can't even make the choice that they need to make in the Democratic Party.
And one of the reasons I think Bloomberg is being successful, and he's got several states that he's targeting, especially California and Texas. He's spending a lot of money in Texas. I think his strategy is get enough delegates to be able to go into the convention, have it maybe be Bernie Sanders and Bloomberg, maybe maybe Biden's got some delegates, but maybe he's got some.
I don't know. Yeah,
I don't know. But get in there and then create a brokered convention, and because there are so many Democrats, they have super delegates that have a lot more power than they do in the Republican Party. But there are so many Democrats who are saying, we will lose if Bernie Sanders is our candidate. We will get trumped out there. And so I think Bloomberg is sort of opening. He sees that opening, that the person sort of taking the role here is Sanders. And he doesn't think most Democrats, especially ones in power, want that. And that sort of created an opening for him that wouldn't normally, because Steyer's got billions of dollars, and he's having zero effect.
No traction.
But Bloomberg is.
Let me give you the numbers, because that was kind of interesting. Out of New Hampshire, if you look at the two, if you will, radicals, and that would be Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, they together got 36% of the vote. Mm-hmm. If you look at the three, and I'm using the word centrist moderates with lots of air quotes, okay, but that was Buttigieg, Klobuchar, and Biden, they got 50%. So right now you've got the, quote, moderate, and I hate to even use the term, or the centrist, fighting for the same vote. And if Elizabeth Warren eventually drops out, then you know where those votes go, right?
Yeah, they probably go to Bernie Sanders.
Yes.
So if that's the case, then Bernie really does take a lead. And it wouldn't surprise me if at some point down the line, the two aren't talking a little bit about saying, if you will go ahead and drop out now, endorse me, I will either make you my vice presidential nominee, or I'll ensure you get a major cabinet position, and so we'll work together as a team.
That would be smart, if that were to happen. But I don't. It seems like politicians have a hard time doing that. But I do think that would be a wise move for Elizabeth Warren. I look at Klobuchar as a true centrist for the Democrats.
Right. Yeah.
She's a leftist, but she's, as far as Democrats go, she's
exactly.
She wouldn't kick the pro-lifers out of the party.
Yeah, I see Joe Biden's kind of mixed up, but I think he is a true more centrist. Yeah. Again, he's getting pulled to the left by, it seems like everything they propose, he ends up going with now, and but in his history, he's been more in that lane. I really don't know who Pete Buttigieg is. I don't know. I think they're calling him a centrist, but I just think he's running for the lane that's open.
Yeah.
And so I think that's part of the problem in here. Is just like it needs to get down to a contest where people can vote for, hey, I'm for the socialism, or I'm for the more centrist Democrat approach, and they can know what they're going to get. But boy, right now they don't have that choice. They got a mess on their hands. And in addition to the people they're voting on, there's this other guy with $1 billion jumping into the campaign late, kind of parachuting in, that they're just learning some of these things about. Some of the comments about taking, that all the crime is because of young black men, and that they should be taken and forced against a wall and have their guns. I mean, that's some really disturbing stuff. I've never heard of even an allegation like that against some Republican candidate. So I think we got a lot more to learn before we're going to get some clarity here.
And there is a debate next week, and this is the first time that Bloomberg will be on the stage. And don't you know, the other candidates are going to say something about that. They already were talking about Buttigieg, who actually was receiving so much money from Silicon Valley. And yet his biggest problem is he has, with all the time and energy, still is at 4% among the African-American vote. And the Trump campaign has been going after the African-American vote, and everybody goes, and there are a lot of people starting to say, no, they're really serious about getting more than 8% this time.
His history in South Bend did not exactly win a lot of African-American support. It was pretty brutal what happened there. So I think that's why the African-American support's not there.
Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we have some very good articles by Dr. Merrill Matthews. We'll look a little bit more at the campaign, and we'll take some of your phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. the Point of View radio talk show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I think y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us today. And again, we're spending some time this hour looking at a couple of issues in the news. Let me just say that, first of all, we've got a number of articles that we have posted. I hope that you'll take the time to read those, maybe pass them on to others. One of our action items is combating human trafficking and online child exploitation. Just wanted to encourage you to send a thank you to the president for signing this executive order on human trafficking. If you'd like to know a little bit more about it, go to the website. As a matter of fact, we have a short article on that. We have a 3-minute video that we produced a while back on the whole issue of sexual trafficking. So that is available. Of course, we've also have an Outlook article on that. And so there are all sorts of resources that are available. But that's your action item for today. Kelly Shackelford and Dr. Merrill Matthews. And Dr. Matthews, let me come to you for just a minute, because we need to talk about Donald Trump. Sooner or later, he's going to have an opponent. And you put out a piece called 2 Cheers for Trump's Budget, and a big boo-boo, or a big boo, if you will, for the Democrat response.
Yes,
and,
indeed.
Talk about that, if you might, for just a minute.
The president released his budget, as he's required to do. And these have become a thing in which even if you've got the same House and Senate and the same party as the president, these are more like markers rather than something that's really going to happen. Suggestions. Yeah. And these days, not even taken that seriously by the House or Senate. But President Trump released his budget, and he essentially wants to cut a number of major elements of the government. He's gone to his cabinet officials and so forth and said, I want you to look and find 5% or something of that nature to trim your budget. So he wants to cut a number of budgets. He wants to cut foreign aid. He wants to increase military spending just a little bit. So the budget talks about how they've got a huge debt. They have to get in control of it. I think that I give that a cheer. They talk about spending is too much. They need to get that under control. I agree with that. But then when you go through, you don't get the sense that a lot of these are, when you go through it, some of these are budget gimmicks a little bit.
Yes, so often. Yeah.
Some of them are not that realistic that they're going to be able to do it. But I applaud him for making the statement. And then Democrats turn around and they just, and Nancy Pelosi's statement was just classic as she criticizes it. She thinks she says this is a quote: "The cruel and short-sighted cuts in President Trump's budget request are a roadmap to a sicker, weaker America. House Democrats will reject this toxic, destructive request, which would hollow out our national strength and fail to meet the needs of the American people." Other than that, Nancy, how do you feel? But the interesting thing is, Dan Mitchell went and took a look at this, and Dan Mitchell said, "I don't see any cuts in here." He highlighted some of the headlines on here that came out, and so I'm going to show some of them to here. He's got Reuters: Trump slashes foreign aid and cuts safety net programs in new budget proposal. New York Magazine: Trump proposes massive cuts to safety net once again. NBC: Trump to propose sweeping cuts to foreign aid safety net programs in latest budget. And then so he goes through and he has graphs of the spending that goes over the next year and years. Yeah. He says, "Can you please show me
where
the cuts are?" You can't see that on there because this is on a black background. But there are no cuts there. I mean, there's a few places where it slows a little bit on the rate of growth, But this has become Washington speak, is if you slow the rate of growth,
that's enough.
Which is all this does.
Only in Washington.
That becomes a drastic cut that will kill American people.
Yes. Only when you cut the rate of growth is that considered a cut. Most of us think a cut is when you get less this year than you did last year. That has never happened.
Yeah, Merrill, I'd love to hear your prescription for how we solve this, because we even heard not too long ago, one of the last budgets, that Mitch McConnell had advised the president that basically you never do anything to cut the budget because all you do is hurt yourself politically. So since you're spending other people's money, don't ever, just kind of spend that and keep going. And it's like anybody who ever proposes any sort of fiscal restraint at all is immediately made into a villain.
Right.
And so it almost politically, there's all these built-in pressures and to make sure that we never get our budget under control. What is the answer? Is there an answer to the process we're in, which seems like it's never going to stop?
One of the some of the people in the Trump team, the economic team, have come to the conclusion that we're not going to be able to actually cut spending. But we can grow our way out of this, because if you have good, strong economic growth, more revenue comes in, and you actually are able to take care of some of that. But the problem is with the budget, there's projecting, I think, a 2.8% increase, our growth in 2021, and then they think it'll bump up to 3% after that. Most other economists looking at this tend to say, no, it's not going to be nearly that much. We don't know yet. If the president managed to get past his trade wars, I suspect you could get 3 or 4% growth. But they sort of shifted over to we can't cut spending, so let's see if we can grow our way out of it. The only problem is they aren't growing fast enough to grow your way out of it.
Yeah.
If the Republicans were to take over the House in the next election and have the House and the Senate and President Trump all in one, would they still not slow the growth? Or
I've come to the conclusion that the only difference between Republicans and Democrats on spending is Republicans claim to feel bad about it. Because it was Paul Ryan who kept signing these extra things, increasing the budgets 1.3%, 1.3 trillion, another 1.3 trillion. We just recently had an agreement, 1.3 trillion, I think it was. Once you have to go and you don't want to shut down the government, it seems like they're willing to do everything. Everybody throws in what they want. You get this huge spending increase, and they all claim victory and go home.
We know they've always talked about a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution and all that. Do you think anything along those lines would ever work?
The concerns from economists like Walter Williams and so forth is that the balanced budget amendment would just force them to raise taxes, not cut spending. Because he argues, and some of the others, is they actually dislike raising taxes less than they like cutting spending. So I don't see an answer right now until you get somebody. Maybe Trump in a second term will get tough and actually begin to cut some spending, but I'm not holding my breath.
Let's take a break, but when we come back, I'll take some phone calls. But I just thought I might mention one other one since we were talking about Donald Trump. We won't talk much about it, but it's a piece by William Marshall, Will the Optimist Trump Run Away from the Election? And his argument is that Donald Trump is not the sunny, cheerful optimist that Ronald Reagan was, but he is an optimist in the sense of, get knocked down and I'm going to get back up again kind of mindset. And what a contrast that is, as we'll be talking about today, with so many quotes that he then has from all the different Democrat candidates, the doom and gloom, and this is a racist country, and even though the economy is doing well, not everybody's doing well, and all the lines we've been hearing. So I did want to point you to that piece. And when we come back from the break, I know somebody's got a question about the Johnson Amendment. That kind of gets us into the issue of religious liberty. And while we're talking about some of the candidates, another very good piece by Dr. Merrill Matthews. Which carbon hypocrite would you want for president? The other day, as a matter of fact, I noticed when Elizabeth Warren was getting off of a private jet, she was hiding behind one of these staffers because these are the people telling us we are at the very edge of the destruction of the planet, so we should not use fossil fuels. And Dr. Merrill Matthews will give you the numbers. It will make your teeth ache. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Jonah Goldberg reminded his readers of a famous essay by Thomas Wolfe entitled The Great Relearning. It was an essay about the summer of love in 1968 in San Francisco. It had great significance to me since I grew up in the San Francisco area during that time, but it also has significance to all of us concerning our culture. He said that the doctors at the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic were treating diseases no living doctor had ever encountered before, diseases that disappeared so long ago that they never even picked up Latin names. He concluded that this happened because the hippies, as they were known, sought nothing less than to sweep aside all codes and restraints of the past and start from zero. They rejected everything from modern society, including basic hygiene. They had lots of sex with each other and shared everything from bed sheets to toothbrushes to food utensils. They were the beneficiaries of centuries of scientific investigation and wise application of sound medical and scientific knowledge, but they decided to tear down some fences and paid a heavy price. Supposedly, G.K. Chesterton warned, "Don't ever take a fence down until you know the reason it was put up." Unfortunately, we had a counterculture in the 1960s that was willing to tear down fences of civilization without giving much thought to why those moral, medical, and sexual guidelines were created in the first place. Does that sound like our world today? Moral anarchy reigns. Our society mimics Judges 17:6, where everyone does what is right in his own eyes. Sexual morality is now based on doing what each person feels is right for them, and marriage has been redefined by divorce and same-sex marriage. All of this suggests that maybe it's time for another great relearning. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Thinking Man Films, Patterns of Evidence, The Red Sea Miracle. The Red Sea Miracle Part 1 in theaters February 18th only. patternsofevidence.com/Red Sea.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Kelly Shackelford and Merrill Matthews in studio, and we'll get to your phone call in just a minute. But again, one of the things that Kelly wanted to talk about is William Marshall said that he predicts that the optimist Donald Trump will do a lot better than any of the candidates who are just talking about doom and gloom. We'll hear about that in just a minute from Dr. Merrill Matthews in terms of the carbon hypocrites running on the Democrat side. But his argument is that, again, Donald Trump is not the optimist that you think of with Ronald Reagan, but he is an individual that doesn't mind taking on his opponents, is willing to give as good as he gets, and is not shy about talking about his successes. And maybe that will bode well.
That's what I was going to say. I think he's got some really built-in advantages. Number one, I mean, the success, right? The economy, the unemployment. I mean, these are record, lowest African-American unemployment ever, lowest employment for Hispanic ever, lowest for women in 70 years. I mean, he's got great things now, but his character and some of the things that people complain about in his character actually works in his favor here because he's not known for humility. Okay. So
you think?
So the idea of talking about his successes, which is exactly what he needs to do, is actually just built into who he is. So he's going to talk about these things. So that's a huge advantage. The Democrats, if you look at what they're doing, I mean, part of this is what do you do when the other side has such an incredible success rate, right? I mean, do you say, well, we could be successful and we have some additional ideas? Well, you're going to stay with the person who brought you all the success, right? So they're having to say, well, it's really bad. But the other problem is when you deal with socialism, which is what Bernie and the others, the whole point of socialism is everything has to be torn down and we have to start all over again. And again, that just doesn't work. The other thing that I think Trump has as just a natural on his side is, again, against this socialism type thing, is America, apple pie, tradition, the flag. Those are all things that, look at what Trump did with the NFL, right? Look at, if you see, he's done this sort of patriotism type thing all the time. And it's something that's very hard for the left to do because, again, they think there are all these problems and America needs to be sort of, shut down and redone again. And so the going into the patriotic kind of things that most Americans love is something that they can't really do because you can't talk down America and lift it up at the same time. And whereas Trump, think of the 4th of July celebration. He loves that kind of, bombast and, patriotism and all that. And so I think he's got a couple of built-in advantages because of his success rate on the economy, et cetera, that are going to make it a little more difficult, even than normal, for the other side to combat.
So again, I might just point you to that article. Let's take a phone call here. I think this will probably go to Kelly. Randy in Missouri, what would you like to add to the conversation today? I think you have a question.
Yes, thank you. I actually have two questions. One's on the status of the Johnson Amendment. I understand that a lot of the language was gutted out of it, and I didn't know if it was still in limbo, the attempts to remove it. And I also wanted to know about if you had any input on the article that appeared in Judicial Watch about the National Institutes of Health records showing where they were buying baby parts from Planned Parenthood, and their part of baby parts broker, Advanced Bioscience Resources. In the article, it shows where they were raising the price for National Institutes of Health, which would not only violate the law, but it would also violate, assumingly, Planned Parenthood's tax-exempt status. Now, a few months ago, back in October, the Center for Biomedical Progress, or for Medical Progress, they were on trial, and it came out in the trial that Planned Parenthood admitted that the videos that were a part of the congressional investigation were authentic. So that would be a second admission by Planned Parenthood that, yes, they were making a profit, and the felonies and other crimes that were found out by the Congressional Committee back in 16 were actually true, and that these videos were actual. So you not only have court testimony, you've got these records now from the National Institutes of Health where you have malfeasance and the Department of Justice about 33 months ago said they were looking into Planned Parenthood and there was an investigation underway, but we had a different Attorney General back there, and Jeff Sessions, and we haven't heard a peep from him. So here's, you got Planned Parenthood admitting the videos are real. You've got the records from the National Institutes of Health. I think the Center for Medical Progress had a big paper trail that they submitted to the Congressional Committee as well. So I know there's some other evidence as well. So what's keeping the Department of Justice from indicting Planned Parenthood?
Good questions.
Yeah, let me answer the first question, which is the Johnson Amendment. The Johnson Amendment, for people who don't know, it's just an IRS regulation that says that if you are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which, by the way, includes most churches, then you're not allowed to really do two things. You're not allowed to advocate for or against a particular candidate in an election, and you're not allowed to provide resources like money, et cetera, to one candidate over another in the elections. This is because Johnson didn't like some conservative nonprofit, wasn't even religious, that had attacked him in the election. And he was like, well, if you're going to be a nonprofit, then you can't be in the election in that way. You can't advocate for or against an opponent. Well, President Trump, when he was campaigning, was really offended that religious leaders were being prevented from speaking into the election. And so he said, that's outrageous. I'm getting rid of the Johnson Amendment. Now, first, let me point out, religious leaders can I mean, the only restriction in this Johnson Amendment is the nonprofit entity. If you're a pastor of a church, you can lead the campaign committee for somebody if you want to. I don't know a lot of people that want to say First Baptist Church of blah, blah, blah endorses so-and-so for president. But can they talk about the elections? Yes. Can they talk about what the Bible says about the issues? Yes. Can they register people to vote? Yes. Can they have voters' guides? Yes. They can do everything you want to do. So a lot of this is the boogeyman, okay? Right. But Trump wanted to at least take away the boogeyman. So the first thing he did is issue an executive order, and he said to his IRS, I don't want you prosecuting any of this. And so he has shut it down for now. So the regulation has not changed because, obviously the Congress, the House especially, is not going to change this law. And so what you've got is, while Trump is president, you've got an executive order that is keeping the enforcement of this regulation because he's ordering the people who work for him in the IRS not to do this because he thinks it's unconstitutional to do that. So I just say that's where it is. If people want to know, by the way, we have a one-page deal that says churches and elections, what's the law? It points out all the freedoms that churches have and that the only two things that even the IRS would say they can't do, endorsing candidates and giving resources. Again, I've never seen a church that wanted to open its coffers to a candidate. Okay, so the things that they are told they can't do, I've never seen a church or a pastor want to do, and they just need to know that. We have a one-pager that lays all that out, right. And they can go to First Liberty. You spell it out, firstliberty.org, or call us and get that. A lot of this is fear, and the president has tried to deal with that in the way he could through an executive order. But, of course, that's just going to be in place as long as he's president, and that's not a change in the law.
And I'll add one quick thing that affects us as a 501c3. We can't support or oppose specific legislation, which might affect the church. If there's a specific, say, pro-life legislation, right. You've got to be careful about saying, we as a church support that specific legislation.
There's a limit. There's a limit on how much you can spend on
right,
that.
You can talk about things and so forth, but you have to be careful about doing that.
And I might just mention, I just went to your website. Yeah, actually, if you type in pastors and politics, that's the way it surfs out. And two things pastors can't do and everything they can. So pastors and politics at First Liberty, just to make sure, because people ask that question all the time. Randy's asked a good question about Planned Parenthood, and I would like to get somebody on that can maybe follow up on some of that, because that's really an important issue. And I've had more than a few people call in and say, if this president is pro-life, why can't we defund Planned Parenthood? And there may be some other ways to do it apart from just having to have a piece of legislation go through Congress. It could be declared that they have violated the law.
Well, he has, too, defunded partially Planned Parenthood, right? They passed the regulations that say that you cannot have an abortion facility intermixed with a facility they're getting federal funds from. And so Planned Parenthood, rather than separate those, decided to just forego the money. Not all their money, but it was a portion.
We need to take a break, but we have a lot more to cover. As a matter of fact, we'll talk about which carbon hypocrite would you want for president. That's by Dr. Merrill Matthews. We'll talk about that right after these important messages.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me mention again that our take action item today is to send a thank you note to the president. It's very simple. We've made it easy. Combating human trafficking and online child exploitation. It's the middle column on our website. Kelly Shackelford just a minute ago talked about First Liberty. Click on his picture, then type in pastors and politics, and you'll find that. We're going to put a link up there in just a minute because sometimes navigating all these websites are hard, so we'll put that up and make it really easy. And, of course, we have a caucus in Nevada on the 22nd. We have a primary in South Carolina on the 29th. And then Super Tuesday, March 3rd, Alabama, Arkansas, California, Massachusetts, Minnesota, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Vermont, Virginia. That's going to be something. So, and that is where, obviously, Michael Bloomberg is putting most of his chips right now to win in California and Texas. But speaking of this, one of the very good pieces that came out earlier this month by Dr. Merrill Matthews, which carbon hypocrite would you want for president? And we have, Dr. Matthews, all sorts of these individuals on the Democrat side who are saying that we're on the very edge of a huge climatic catastrophe, and so we need to reduce your carbon footprint. Well, these campaigns spend a lot of time and money and lease a lot of private jets, and you ran the numbers, so give us some understanding of what that is.
I got the numbers from Brent Scher at the Free Beacon, where he has gone and looked at this, and Bernie Sanders has spent about $1.2 million leasing private jets as he travels various places, and that's in the last quarter or two.
Right.
Those
numbers are all going up right now, as you know.
Those numbers are all going up.
Yes.
Biden is just about 1 million. Warren is at 720,000, and then Buttigieg is about 323,000. So and Bloomberg is recording 646,000. Now he always flies in a private jet, so for the campaign purposes, for be able to write it off, he's doing it at 646. So that raises the question: you're flying from campaign to campaign, speech to speech, using private jets. In fact, Bernie's the company he goes to calls them luxury private jets. It's good to be a millionaire running as a Democrat. So, but they're doing this, and then when they get there, they say we have to cut the carbon. And I don't have a problem with a presidential candidate, leasing a private jet, because they're having to go one place to the other very quickly. They're trying to cover lots of distance, get in front of people all around the country. What I have a problem is when they do that and then they stand up and lecture the rest of us about how much carbon we use on ours, and then it's sort of saying we've got to cut down. But if one of them gets elected president, they'll get to fly around in Air Force One. I mean, it's going to be an upgrade for them.
Well, and I've got to put something on the table because I want to hear the conversation between you and Kelly, because the Sanders campaign says, oh, well, we've mitigated this by buying carbon offsets. Explain what those are.
There are companies out there that don't use much carbon, and they get credits from the federal government. And if you use more carbon than you're supposed to be using, then you go and give them money to offset that. So Bernie Sanders' campaign says they spent about $32,000 buying carbon offsets. Now, as I say in the piece, this is nothing but a sin offering to assuage my guilt for using carbon, because they aren't using any less carbon.
Exactly.
No Democrat is saying, "Oh my goodness, I've already flown X number of miles. I've used my carbon allotment. I've got to walk to the next two campaign rallies." They're flying all they want to, and if they think they have a chance and they get more money, they'll fly even more. So they give the money to somebody else. So this is just let's just say, redistribution scheme, where money goes from one group to another group to make them to sort of say we haven't to assuage their guilt for using so much carbon.
It's ridiculous. This is like one of these left-wing crazies. I mean, this is crazy. I mean, the idea is if you're concerned about something, then you wouldn't do something that you thought would cause all this extra damage to the environment. But what they're saying is, I'm going to cause the extra damage, but then I'm going to pay money. Does the paying of the money clean up the environment any that you just caused? No, it doesn't do anything. It's like a penance, but it's worse because at least with a penance, it goes to somebody that's going to do something really good. In this case, it's just, yes, I know I'm damaging the environment. I mean, so it's almost like what they're doing is worse than a Republican who's using the same amount of jets, because the Republican doesn't think that they're damaging the environment. They think that the climate can handle what's going on, that there's no, but if you really think that what you're doing is damaging and you get on a plane and spend $1 million riding around in your private jet in 4 months or 3 months, a hypocrite is right, but it's even worse than that to me. You don't care that you're damaging the country.
The Independent, a newspaper out of London, estimated that went around and tried to get an estimate, and they said that using the private jet roughly uses about 10 times the carbon that you would if you were using a commercial jet. Of course, if you're on a commercial jet, you're using a lot more than if you're riding a bicycle or walking.
Of course.
So this is why, and I say that this is why I think so many people will say, yes, we want a clean environment. We want to make sure we're doing that. But you people are just hypocrites, and they don't take it seriously because they see the people who are doing this do not take it seriously.
And everything I've ever seen, Marilyn, I don't study this as much as you do, but everything I've ever seen, and this is what makes sense to me too, says the more developed you become, the more you're able to use energy and fuels, et cetera, actually the better you get at cleaning things up. Mm-hmm. And so it's actually the opposite of what they're saying, that you tend to have cleaner environments. You're more friendly to the environment if you're more developed and you have these fuels to make you more developed. And they would like to take us back to where no fossil fuels, we would actually have an environment that's worse.
The Kevin McCarthy, the minority leader in the House, introduced with some Republicans their proposal to do several things to help clean the environment, one of which is called carbon capture and sequestration. And what they do is they capture the carbon through various processes. It's expensive now, but there are 19 facilities in the world that are trying to do the carbon capture and then clean carbon out of the and then they actually use the carbon sequestration. They push it in the ground, and that actually helps them extract more oil or natural gas. But the left in saying, well, this is at least a good step because you're going to try to address the carbon in the atmosphere. The left is saying we cannot have any of this because it doesn't go far enough, and because they use the carbon capture, they use that to help them extract more fossil fuels, and so they're feeding this issue. But I think it's a good Republican step, but they're getting a lot of pushback from Democrats and even some Republicans.
Well, I want to move on to another topic because it's a good one, but if you'd like to read all of that, that is on our website, pointofview.net. But I did want to get Kelly's comments about the Attorney General, and that is, of course, Roger Stone was sentenced originally to 7 to 9 years, and Tucker Carlson the other day said, now, wait a minute, this is a nonviolent crime, if you will, and assuming that it is a crime. And he said, we checked and found the average rapist sentence was 4 years. The average armed robber sentence was 3 years, and we're going to give a guy that is, 67 years of age, 9 years. And so obviously there was a desire to change that. And, of course, to his credit, the Attorney General did so. But then immediately we get these Trump tweets. And so we saw an interview the other day in which Bill Barr said, Mr. Trump's outbursts are making it impossible for me to do my job.
Yeah, this was an example of, this is a ridiculous recommendation from the Justice Department. And by the way, the people who recommended this that resigned in protest, they were Obama people. One of them, a clerk for Merrick Garland, who he was suggesting on the Supreme Court. There's all kinds of ties. So, excuse me, but I'm not really, please go on and resign the rest of the way and leave the Justice Department. This is ridiculous. It's 7 to 9 years because you supposedly, weren't truthful with Congress. Okay, well, James Comey lied before Congress. He hasn't even been prosecuted, right? Brennan, Clapper. There's a bunch of these people that clearly were not truthful before Congress. I'm fine with prosecuting those people and punishing them, but the idea that you would put them in prison for 7 to 9 years is ridiculous. And the problem was that, and so immediately when the Attorney General saw this, he realized this is wrong. We need to reevaluate this. We need to redo this. It doesn't really meet the sentencing guidelines correctly. But the problem was that Trump saw this and thought it was outrageous too, and he tweeted. So immediately the left wing all goes crazy and says, Trump caused Barr to change his position. Anybody that knows Bill Barr knows nobody's going to tell him to change his position, not even Donald Trump. So it's silly, but it's making his job more difficult. And
We'll talk
I'm
more
glad
about
he said
that in
this.
just a minute, just to get some perspective, because Roger Stone is in the news right now. So is Donald Trump, and so is Bill Barr. We'll be right back.
During the past decade or so, pro-life state legislators have been passing laws placing common sense, often very modest restrictions on abortion. It's sad to see a lot of this progress wiped out when a different party comes into power. This is happening right now in the state of Virginia. The new Democratic majority in Virginia's House and Senate is working to pass a package of bills that will reverse these protective laws. One bill removes Virginia's requirement that abortions be performed by doctors. Nurse practitioners, physician's assistants, and certified nurse midwives will soon be allowed to abort babies. There's also a bill repealing Virginia's informed consent requirement, under which abortion providers must provide each woman at least 24 hours notice of her right to withdraw consent for the procedure, to speak with the physician who is to perform the abortion, and to know the gestational age of her unborn child. Another bill takes abortion facilities out of the hospital category, thus weakening their safety regulations. The hard-won requirements that an ultrasound be performed on each woman seeking abortion, and that she be given the opportunity to see that sonogram, will be gone. Mandatory parental consent for minors seeking abortion will be abolished. Pro-abortion advocates told Associated Press they hope to make Virginia a safe haven for women in neighboring conservative states. Tarina Keene, executive director of NARAL Pro-Choice America, says, these laws have been about shaming women, stigmatizing abortion, shutting off access, discouraging doctors from providing this care. Care? These protective laws were a way to enhance safety and provide protective care for women who chose abortion, which is not care. Every abortion kills an unborn baby and damages its mother. Pro-choice advocates in blue states see the Supreme Court chipping away at Roe v. Wade. They worry Roe will be reversed, so they are proactively repealing these abortion restrictions where they can and negating a decade of progress. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and again, we have in studio with us today Kelly Shackelford and Merrill Matthews. Let me just mention, we actually now posted a link to Pastors and Pastors and Politics. I misread that there. 2 things pastors can't do during the election season, everything they can. The next article is one that we've had posted there. It's called Freedom of Religious Schools, and it has to do with the fact, Kelly, that you filed a friend of the court brief urging the Supreme Court to protect the right of religious schools to decide who teaches their classes. Now, you would think that would be one of those basic common sense ideas, but you'd be wrong, because that's something that has to be going all the way to the Supreme Court.
It's a very important case. Our friends at Beckett are doing that case, and we filed a supportive brief but it's a very, very important case because there's a concept called church autonomy. And what this is that there is a jurisdiction that the church has that really the government has no right to enter. What would that be? Well, can the government tell you what your doctrine can be? No, of course not. Can the government tell you who can and cannot be members in your church? No. Can the government tell you who your religious leaders who inculcate or teach what your positions are? No, the government can't do those. And everybody agrees the government can't do that. So those areas are areas that the government can't even pass laws to impact. So, for instance, think of right now we have laws against discrimination in employment on the basis of sex, right? Well, how does the Catholic Church get away with not having any women priests? Because of this very doctrine that this is church autonomy. This is authority that courts do not have a right to enter. And so what happened in this case is the lower court, the Ninth Circuit, said, well, yeah, we know this was a teacher that was responsible in part for inculcating the teachings of the Catholic Church to these kids, but not really important enough to get the protection of, church autonomy because it wasn't like the head priest or whatever. And so that's what they're going to determine. And this will affect, all religious schools, but beyond all religious schools, every religious institution. You think of all the Christian organizations in the country and their right to pick their people who really carry their mission. And this will make sure that is not going to be invaded by a lot of these politically correct laws that get passed in different communities. So a very important case, and it'll be argued in the future, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more then, but it's one that people should have on their radar.
We always talk about eternal vigilance is the price for liberty. Because if I remember right, wasn't there a unanimous case back in 2012? Wasn't that was it the Tabor? Yeah.
Yes.
And I thought we already solved this issue, just like I thought we solved the cross issue out there in Mojave Desert and had to deal with it again in Maryland. It seems like every time we turn around, you have to, it's like whack-a-mole, hit another one of those things that pop up, right?
Well, the way it typically works, I think, is you go in the first time and you nail the principle, and then you go in the second time and you sort of put the nail in the coffin.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what's happening. In Hosanna Tabor, the court said there's this protection, the ministerial protection, but now it's, well, does it really apply to more people than just the minister? And the answer is yes, it does. And it applies to teachers who are teaching these kids. I mean, can you think the idea that the government can come in and change who your teachers are in a Christian school who are trying to inculcate your message? That's really outrageous, but that's what the lower court, the Ninth Circuit, said. And so important case that I feel, because of the justices we have on the Supreme Court right now, I feel like this will be at least a 5-4 decision the right way, if not more.
Yes. Again, so pastors and politics, also freedom of religious schools. Dr. Merrill Matthews, one of the things we also have done today is posted a couple of your articles, but if you go to ipi.org, they'll find some articles that we've already posted, but you also have the book that came out, or booklet, however you want to call it, On the Edge, America Faces the Entitlements Cliff, something we were talking about. And some of your other people are talking about how we seem to be surrendering our IP system to China. Yeah, China's showing up again. So talk about a few things we can find on your website.
Well, we post everything on the website, so they can go there and download anything. We talk about, there's a couple pieces about technology issues.
Right.
So those are there. I've got some pieces on the election, on environment and other things. So there's just a wide range of things, and people can run through that. Everything is available there free of charge for people to consume and share.
And again, we have First Liberty, but just since we have a few minutes left, we've got a couple of caucuses coming up here and primaries. Nevada is the 22nd, so we'll have a chance maybe over this next week to take a breath. And then 29th, and then, of course, March 3rd, the Super Tuesday.
Nevada had the same app that Iowa had.
Yes, okay. Talk about that, because I was going to get into that.
My understanding is they decided they're not going to
use it. Yeah.
So maybe Nevada will go a little more smoothly than Iowa did.
Let me go around the round table, though. What happened to Joe Biden? Any thoughts?
Oh, he is. But, Joe's tried to run twice, and he didn't do well in Iowa the first couple of times that he ran. And one time he had to step down because he'd been plagiarizing Neil Kinnock, the socialist leader from Great Britain.
Some of us old guys remember that.
Copied 6 pages out of that, and that was before the internet, where you could really do these searches easily and find out who you stole your material from. So talk about intellectual property theft.
But again, did I always, going to get Kelly's comment as well, was it just that he was a paper tiger all the time? I mean, all of a sudden we have an individual that came in 4th and 5th in the last 2 primaries or caucus. What about that?
Yeah, I'll give one guy I'll give credit to is Tucker Carlson. From day one, he said, come on, this guy's not going to be the nominee. He said that from day one, and he was right. Joe Biden has run before. He never had success. It's obvious why. He can't put his words together. He's not the guy people are going to pick as a leader of the country. I mean, he fumbles his sentences, every day and says really, things that are very embarrassing. I think most people think his brain is not all connecting right now. Right? He's got some synapse problems, right. And whether that's age or it's just kind of his makeup, I'm sure there's lots of great things he does, but people are not going to pick him. And I think it's really obvious now. Now, obviously South Carolina is his best choice because he had a strong, support from African American community. And I think Merrill might know this, but I think in the Democratic Party in South Carolina, I think maybe 2/3 of the vote is African American. It's a large percentage.
It's big, but there were reports in the last couple of days that the African American vote may be actually abandoning him because they've looked at him and think the guy's just losing. And do we really want to hitch our wagon to a loser?
And so that's what I expect. I mean, I think anybody who runs on electability is in real danger because as soon as the fluff sort of moves, you're dead because you should be running
issues.
Yeah, you should be running on why you really should be picked and just add the electability. But the whole point with Biden was electability, which made it really a paper tiger. So I think he's going to be gone in the near future, and we're going to see the adjusting amongst the other candidates as to who's going after that more middle Democrat vote.
You wrote about Elizabeth Warren, and many people thought Elizabeth Warren would get the votes from Bernie Sanders. Is it possible that Elizabeth Warren's voters now go to Bernie Sanders?
I think it's entirely possible that Elizabeth Warren at some point may step out and decide to have a deal with Bernie Sanders on the side along the lines of, I'm going to ask my voters to support you, but I want to be either vice president or some kind of cabinet secretary.
Yeah, so we'll see how that plays out. Well, I appreciate you both being here. And, of course, we have a little bit of breathing room next week before the next one on the 22nd, and then one after that, the 29th. But March 3rd is looming.
It's on its way.
It certainly is. Well, before I end, just want to remind everybody it's Valentine's Day. If you're hearing this live, now they also rebroadcast this, so if you're hearing it Saturday, it's too late. So I know you two guys have done very well by your wives. I have as well. So that is good. But I just thought for anybody that doesn't realize what the day is, it is Valentine's Day.
Somewhere out there, some guy's going, oh, no!
And run into a florist shop where there aren't many flowers left. But anyway, I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. We're going to watch Baylor basketball. We'll see you back here on Monday.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.